Well, it's really hard for me to believe that nearly 15 years have passed since my book on Nazi art looting and the recovery activities following World War II was published, and more than 25 years have passed since it first occurred to me to look into the history of these events. I was really far from the first to be interested in this history. Indeed, from the first post-war years, there had been a thin but steady stream of books and articles on the subject of what we now call the displacement of art in the Nazi era. But by the 1970s, the extraordinary and highly successful restitution and compensation efforts carried out in the post-war years in every affected nation had come to an end, overtaken by more immediate events like the Cold War and things like that. And worse, it had all been forgotten and is still ignored by the media, who love to proclaim that, quote, nothing had been, today when you read stories about this, that nothing has been done for 70 years whenever an art claim surfaces. And the amazing amount of investigative work done by Allied military and recuperation officials, and later by the restitution agencies of Germany and other countries, was buried deep in dusty archives. Those investigations that still provide the information basis for the cases of today were led by a group of Allied art historians who came from the top ranks of their universities and museums, now sort of universally referred to as the monuments men. And one of the leaders of them was Francis Henry Taylor, who was director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art before and during the war. And at least two of the most important ones are household words in this very building. I refer, of course, to Chuck Parkhurst, here shown in his naval uniform, and the legendary Lane Faison. Lane hated this picture. It shows him in Germany during the war, but when he was in the OSS and investigating the looting that by Hitler, particularly by Hitler's organization. Lane was really one of my most important mentors, as he was for so many other people in the art history world. He was one of the first people I interviewed doing this book, and that was back in the dark ages of the, digital of tape recorders and things, and I had a little one with me, and he said to me, "Those things never work." So we were sitting in a restaurant here, and he was telling me the story, and of course it didn't work, and so I had to take notes furiously. But later on, after I'd gotten my act together, he was very kind, and he read my whole manuscript before it was published and made a number of very useful corrections. He never lost interest in this topic, and both he and Chuck were advisors for the film you may have seen earlier, which is based on the book and other sources of information, and constant commenters on the really ever hot topic of art claims and restitution. What then caused the revival of interest in this in the 90s, really, was when the revival happened. And I think it was because numerous strands came together. There were preparations for the commemorations of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And by that time, many historians had published studies of the Holocaust, which had become a discipline in its own right. And more importantly, I think the Cold War ended, and the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall came down, and with them, many of the barriers to the exchange of information regarding the objects that had been taken to the former Soviet Union and been hidden both by its government and a number of private individuals in the Soviet Union. It was revealed, for instance, that the famous Schliemann gold treasure taken from Berlin was in the Pushkin Museum, and a fabulous collection of Impressionists in the Hermitage. Very fine, they're still there. This is a Degas, which everybody would like to have. Individuals, governments, and institutions who thought that they had lost things forever were thus given renewed hope that their treasures, this is a drawing from the Koenig's collection that was looted from Holland or sold from Holland and is now in the Soviet Union, and the Dutch government is claiming it. And then on top of that, the Koenig's family is claiming it from the Dutch government. So far nothing has happened, but it's an ongoing case. But anyway, everyone hoped and still does hope that things might be found, and they began to consider new claims. Along with these revelations came the passing of the World War II generation. People would die, and their relatives, trying to sell off the stuff they found in the attic, suddenly found that it wasn't really theirs. One of the most famous cases, and there's a nice book written about this by William Honan of the New York Times, was a collection of priceless objects stolen by a GI from a German church. And the church was in East Germany after, the dividing up of Germany. So the Army had started a case on this, but when the Iron Curtain came down, that was the end of that. But the soldier had just, they were not very big objects, 11th century kind of stuff, beautiful. He just put them in small boxes and sent them back through the APO. And when he died in Texas, his heirs tried to sell them. Interest in this issue led to political involvement at very high levels in many nations and a plethora of suggestions for action. And as is natural in human events, many of these suggestions were and still are agenda-driven and not free of chauvinism. The addition of the issues of Swiss gold, real estate, insurance, and slave labor to the mix brought even more attention to these 50-year-old events and led eventually to the promulgation of various governmental and private sector guidelines and principles concerning looted art. And on the government level, the Washington principles, and as Michael was saying, there was a conference in Prague last year, and something called the Terezin Declaration was put out, all offering guidelines on looted art. And also the American Association of Museums has guidelines, as does the Dealers Association, and the same is true in most countries. These pronouncements and guidelines, although extremely well-intentioned, are way too simple and simplistic, I should say, and don't really, in fact, allow for the complexity of the restitution issue. The Nazi era lasted a long time and went through many, many stages in different countries, and so we must resist an oversimplification of the history. Policies of confiscation developed gradually. Nazi enforcement was uneven and personal circumstances extremely varied, and there's really no black and white here. Sweeping global solutions are simply not possible. This is also true of collaboration and forced sales. Indeed, just what is included under the latter rubric of forced sale is the subject of very wide and ever-expanding interpretations, especially by lawyers, some of the interpretations being much more sensible than others. In the end, there's really no way around considering each case within the exact context of the events of personal and wartime history, and the facts in each case are unique, and their proper consideration is the only fair way to proceed. So really, people working in this area need a lot of history of what went on. So this afternoon, I'm going to give you a very lightweight overview of the fate of art in the World War II era, when basically, I think it's fair to say, every work of art in Europe was displaced or threatened in one way or another. You always have to have the Mona Lisa. She was moved around. The transfer of works of art from vanquished to victor is really as old as warfare itself. But the displacement of art in World War II was unprecedented in a number of ways. Never before had objects been moved about on such a scale, literally by the millions. And for the first time in history, the armies of all the belligerents had highly trained art specialists in their ranks. Here's one of my favorites, Edith Standen, a monuments lady, who was later the tapestry curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I don't know if you saw that there were two fantastic tapestry shows there, which largely had to do with her preparatory work. But these people, basically their duty was to secure and preserve notable works and movable works of art, and their professionalism, no matter what their ideology and which country they were from, essentially saved most of the treasures of Europe. The fact that there were art specialists at all in the Allied armies was really something of a miracle. The British and American commands had been distinctly reluctant to allot resources to such frills, feeling that the existing rules of land warfare were enough protection for works of art. But the American Museum establishment knew better, and after months of lobbying by some of the men you saw before, persuaded President Roosevelt, the Congress, and the Army, no easier to do that then than it has been recently, that such officers were needed not only to protect ancient monuments from graffiti-minded soldiers, this is what happened in North Africa to one of the Libyan museums, but also to trace after the war the vast numbers of objects that were known to have been displaced for various reasons since the Nazis had come to power. A presidential commission was set up to supervise this effort, and given the princely appropriation of $25,000 to save the patrimony of Europe. It wasn't as little as it sounds like in those days, but still, it wasn't a lot. The first of these specialists, who are now known as the Monuments Men, were recruited from the ranks of the leading museums of the United States and Britain, as I said. Their first experience was in the fighting in Sicily after North Africa, where there was a huge amount of devastation to the monuments, and later on they moved on to the south of Italy. It was a good thing they were there, because even as distinguished a soldier as General Patton had trouble with ancient ruins. On his way to Palermo, he passed a roofless temple, which was under guard, and anxiously asked a local farmer if it had been damaged by American artillery fire. No, the farmer said, that was done in the last war. And Patton, who was quite a history buff, was puzzled and said, what war was that? And the farmer said, oh, the Second Punic War, of course. I'm sure that's an absolutely true story, but anyway. Vandalism later on by Allied troops in Naples, and here we have guys having a good time in a palace bed, and the fierce fighting south of Rome, which Churchill described as the red-hot rake of war. And I think, it's really hard for us to imagine in this country where we've never experienced much of this, what that meant. This is Cisterna, just north of Nettuno Beach, one of the great amphibious landing sites. Well, this sort of destruction led to the appointment of more monuments men and to their placement closer to the battle lines. And there was huge support for art experts from museum staffs in this country. The Frick Library, for instance, was turned over its entire staff to the war effort, and they made lists and maps of European monuments. This is a bombing map of Florence, which was marked by the people at the Frick, and you can see the little white dots there, have numbers, and those are the things that they were not supposed to bomb. Down at the bottom of the map, you see the railroad yards of Florence, which had to be bombed because the Germans were shipping all of their ammunition through there. And they did bomb it, and they didn't hit any of the great monuments. The same happened in Arles in France, but it didn't always work. This is the building which holds the Last Supper, and you can see the Last Supper is behind that scaffolding, so it's just a miracle that it survived. But no one could save things that were in the direct line of combat, and damage was severe both in Italy and later in Normandy. This is Caen, just behind the lines of D-Day lines. Captured buildings that were too unstable for safety were blown up by the engineers, and after that there was not much the monuments men could do but kind of try to salvage bits and pieces of important elements of the buildings so that to keep them being pulverized for landfill, or road fill, which is what the engineers like to do with rubble. Further on into northern France, the monuments men, to their relief, began to find the big repositories with the French national treasures. This is Lille. This is a great picture with James Rorimer in the helmet, who would later be director of the Metropolitan, and Germain Bazin from the Louvre opening up a repository in the north of France. The French museum people were quite suspicious of the Americans because they didn't know what our intentions were, and they wouldn't tell us at first where things were. And there was a lot that had been moved, not at first to just behind the Loire to chateaus like Chambord, but later on way down into the southern part of France, which was unoccupied for a long time. The curators had gotten very countrified out there. They'd taken to raising cattle so that they could eat. You know, there was not much food. They had a cow named MN for Musée Nationaux at one refuge, and they only found out too late that it was a beef. It wasn't a cow, and so it didn't give milk. So it led to her early demise, or his early demise. And the chief curator of the Louvre, there's some wonderful pictures. René Huyghe had his own sort of private army with great bandoliers of bullets and stuff, which was mostly meant to keep away the resistance rather than the Germans, who actually took very good care of the French collections, believing that they would eventually be able to control them all. It wasn't until they reached Paris in 1944 that the monuments men would begin to understand the methodology and the magnitude of Nazi looting. They had taken everything out of the Louvre. That's the place where the Mona Lisa is supposed to be hanging. They'd written with chalk behind each picture to show what was supposed to be there. And nothing could have been a greater contrast to the Allied efforts, because the Nazi impetus had come from Hitler himself, who had envisioned nothing less than the complete rearrangement of all the works of art in accordance with Nazi ideology. Making off with the treasures of conquered lands was nothing new. In fact, the French under Napoleon held the existing world's record at the time, but the extent of the Nazi operations was really unprecedented. There were 4 major, well-funded bureaucracies in Germany that concerned themselves exclusively with art matters, and they were supported by the full force of Nazi military and police organizations. Hitler's personal agency, and we see Hitler and Goering here looking at a Makar painting. Hitler's agency was established to build up a huge collection for a museum complex he intended to build in his hometown of Linz in Austria. He was inspired by the great Italian museums he'd visited with Mussolini. This is a great picture, I think, of Mussolini and Hitler and Ciano and Goebbels and Himmler over there in the background. I was really fascinated to learn when I started on this that Hitler had never actually been to Italy or almost anywhere else in his life, so that this was really a revelation for him, and he wanted to have own art and display it on the same scale as had been done in Rome and Paris and everywhere else. The Linz operations were monitored daily by Hitler. Even in the midst of battle, he would have letters and stuff sent to his headquarters in the East Front. It's unbelievable when you look in the archives. I mean, stuff written all over them where they were sent. And the agency would, in contrast to our presidential commission, would be given nearly 20 million World War II dollars in its 5 years of existence. And at the end, Hitler would have collected some 8,000 paintings with rights to thousands more, plus the millions of other objects being gathered by his colleagues. Goering, I love this picture, amassed over 2,000 works himself and spent much more time on art matters than Hitler did. Even the SS was into art, or especially archaeology, a field which they dominated entirely in Germany in the Nazi era. And their objective was to prove that Germanic people had been superior to all others from prehistoric times. And even Hitler found this completely ridiculous, but he didn't stop them. Alfred Rosenberg, who was the ideological leader of the party, set up an organization called the ERR, which at first limited itself to collecting Jewish books for a planned anti-Semitic think tank. Here we see some of the books he took waiting for the think tank to be built, but later expanded to all fields of art. So by war's end, these groups and their many subsidiaries, by confiscation and purchases on the encapsulated European art market, which had a boom unequaled until the 1980s, would have accumulated literally tons of objects of all kinds, from paintings to statues to church bells. But the reshuffling of works had begun actually in Germany itself long before the war. From the first day Hitler gained power, he set about the implementation of his dream of a pure Germanic empire. Pure and Germanic were the operative words, and art was, just one of the many things that were to be controlled completely. Germany was to be purged of all so-called degenerate works and the artists responsible for them. Hitler had no doubts at all about what was not acceptable for anything, for example, anything unfinished or abstract, like this work by Kandinsky, a painting by Mark, even though Mark had died in World War I. George Gross, of course, because he satirized the Prussian military establishment. Käthe Kollwitz, because she was anti-war. Not surprising, since her son had been killed in World War I. And Pissarro, example, because he was Jewish. It took Hitler's own colleagues a long time to figure out what the rules were. Goebbels, for example, had decorated his dining room with lots of paintings by Nolde, who was a Nazi party member. But they were too abstract, and when Hitler came to dinner, he had one of his famous anger fits, and Goebbels took them all down. And Nolde was banished to a remote seacoast town where he secretly continued to paint tiny postcards, which reminds me of Emily Dickinson. He hid behind the wallpaper all during the war. The restrictions on banned artists were well enforced by the Gestapo, who even went so far as to visit their studios and feel the brushes and smell the air to see if they'd been used and see if they could smell turpentine. There was enormous pressure, of course, on German museums to get rid of bad art. When in 1937 they hadn't complied in the way that Hitler wanted, Hitler sent committees of Nazi artists and theories right into the galleries, who decided as they walked through what had to go. It's hard to imagine. Now, this was hard work, not only because the curators had actually hidden things in the closets and the bathrooms in order to save them, but because agonizing decisions had to be made. This Corinth, for instance, the sky is considered degenerate because it's kind of messy looking, but the rest of it was okay, so it was allowed to stay. But in the end, over 16,000 works were removed from German museums, and to make sure everybody got the message, a selection was displayed in a series of degenerate art exhibitions. Here we see Hitler and Goering at one of the shows. They reproduced this at LACMA a few years ago, and there's a terrific catalog book about it. But they would have rude remarks about the art written on the walls, and how much the curator had paid. A lot of the curators who bought modern art were fired. So it was an enormous campaign, and it was actually one of the most popular shows that was ever went on in Munich. And then it traveled around the country. But while the Nazis found these works unacceptable for the home folks, they were not so pure as to ignore their value. So soon there was a thriving trade in works banished from Germany, which was especially beneficial to the new and growing collections of modern art in the United States and elsewhere. One of the best-known paintings to be deaccessioned from a German museum and sold over here eventually is Van Gogh's Dr. Gachet, which for a while held the record for the most expensive painting in the world. And now I'm not sure where it is. It went on to Japan and has, for the moment, I think, disappeared. Goering was the first Nazi official to catch on to such commercial possibilities, and it was his agent who sold the Dr. Gachet. Later on, a special secret marketing organization was set up where you could get banned works for foreign currency only. So you could only buy these things with Swiss francs and dollars. And some nice things here, Picasso, self-portrait, Van Gogh. After a time to speed things up, the government put on a full-fledged auction in Switzerland in 1939, where, for example, Joseph Pulitzer, there on his honeymoon, bought Matisse's famous Bathers with a Turtle, which still hangs in St. Louis today. Most of the leftovers of this operation were eventually burned in a practice exercise by the Berlin Fire Department. It was a tremendous loss to the German museums. And the degenerate art policy, as we shall see, was not only important for Germany. Later on, it would determine the fate of many work that was confiscated from private collections in the conquered countries. Meanwhile, Hitler himself was involved in commissioning and choosing suitable works for his new contemporary museum, the Haus der Deutschen Kunst in Munich, the first building he ever commissioned. It shows how important this all was to him. The museum opened with a very elaborate parade it was full of Vikings and Rhine maidens and other Nordic heroes. Thousands of works in pretty bad taste were submitted to yearly shows there, all during the war. This is called Peasant Venus. I think her socks are really nice. But anyway, most of these things had to be, there were other ones of Hitler in white armor, but mostly they had to be bought by the government. And some of them have ended up in the hands of the United States government in Washington, especially if they're considered very propagandistic. Along with the purging of degenerate art in Germany went the purging of what the Nazis considered degenerate or alien races. The first idea was to force such people, particularly Jews, principally Jews, to leave Germany. But before they left, they would be forced to sell most of their assets, often at government-controlled auctions. Outright confiscation from people's houses didn't begin until 1938, after the extreme looting in Austria at the time of the Anschluss and the vicious events of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November of that year. And this is a commode that was taken from the Rothschild Palace in Vienna, and it has been restituted, but I think it's now at the Getty. As it became clearer to the art community in the rest of Europe during the 30s that Hitler was headed toward war, major preparations began. This was the first war in which the bombing of cities would be a problem. And everyone there is the Meninas, everyone is aware that the Prado in Madrid had been bombed in the Spanish Civil War and that the collections had survived only because of their timely evacuation. Polish curators shipped hundreds of tapestries down the Vistula, onward to Rome, and eventually to Canada to save them. Italian statues came down, and the Venetian collections went to shelter, looking very perilous. Here, I don't know, it might have been better to leave them in the museum. The Night Watch in Amsterdam, which you may know is a huge painting, was first rolled up. You can see just the main figure there, and went to storage looking like this. It was in a bunker on the coast of Holland toward England, and then later it was moved to Maastricht, where you now have the famous art fair. In France, pictures were taken in the Louvre, taken out of their frames in the Grand Gallery, and packed in special boxes that were made for them. And some of the things were so big, like the raft of the Medusa, that they had to get trucks from the Comédie Française to move them out of Paris, because they were too big and too fragile to roll up. And I think in a moment of the greatest emotion, the Winged Victory came down the grand staircase of the Louvre and was eventually moved to Valençay. The French collections would be moved 3 times more to the ever more remote refuges that I mentioned before. And the British did the same. They moved the contents of the National Gallery to a cave in Wales. When you read the story, I mean, there was icy roads, and they had to build this whole infrastructure in the mountain, in this mountain, to protect them. But it was worth the effort. This is the Rembrandt Room in the National Gallery in London during the Blitz. After Pearl Harbor, the American museums also would send their best things to shelters. One director actually wondered if anyone would notice. This was in the early days of museums. And the process showed a certain hysteria at first. The MoMA took its best things down every night and put them back up in the morning, which that was only for a little while that they did that. MFA in Japan sealed off its Japanese galleries and posted Minutemen on the roof. A congressman suggested that all the white buildings in Washington, this is the National Archives, be painted in camo, and that the roof of the National Gallery be used as an anti-aircraft emplacement. The gallery wasn't even open yet. But in the end, calm prevailed. The Boston things actually came here to Williamstown. I don't know whether they were here in this museum or where they were. The National Gallery's best 75 pictures went to Biltmore down in the Carolinas, and the Metropolitan items went to the wilds of suburban Philadelphia. But no U.S. museum closed, the consensus being that it was their duty to stay open and support public morale. Before Hitler got to France and Holland, he had invaded Poland and started to impose his ideology there. The Nazis considered the Slavs to be an alien race in the same sense that the Jews were, and their long-term policy for Eastern Europe included the total elimination of the Slavic peoples and their culture. Thus, anything Slavic could be destroyed, while Germanic things found in the East were to be taken back to Germany. One major example of this is the Wittstoss altarpiece from Krakow. It was made in Germany, but it was commissioned by the Polish king. But it went back to Germany and eventually was hidden in Nuremberg. Of course, anything that was non-Slavic, that was of high quality, would be taken as well, like this nice Leonardo from Krakow, too, because the Slavic peoples were considered unworthy of possessing them. These policies were even more forcefully carried out in the Soviet Union, where the Amber Room, for instance, was dismantled and removed from outside of St. Petersburg. The Russians had waited until very late to evacuate things. Most of it was taken to Siberia, and only about half the millions of objects from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg were moved out before the siege of that city. And it's interesting that during the siege, the Hermitage became a great center of resistance. People lived in the cellars, and they had, sort of fomented courageous meetings to try to keep things going. And they stayed alive by eating conservatives' glue, and an extraordinary story. All during the bombing and the siege, the curators continued to struggle to keep the clear up the glass from the bombings and keep the snow cleared out of the galleries. It was an incredibly courageous act. This is the same gallery that you saw in the first slide of the of the Hermitage, but with the pictures taken out. After Poland, it was the turn of the Western countries to be occupied. Here the policy was quite different. These countries were to be annexed one way or another to the fatherland, and their national collections would eventually be totally rearranged to suit Hitler, but only a few things were taken at first. This sort of rearranging idea was nothing new, as I said. Napoleon had done much the same after his conquest. He even had a parade of things that he brought back from Egypt. This wonderful print shows camels and things and the horses from Venice that he had taken. He's having a little parade there. And after his defeat, Lord Wellington, the Allied commander, made the French give back most of what they'd taken, but they managed to hide a lot, and Hitler knew that and was determined to retrieve those things. Plus, anything taken from Germany as part of the Versailles Treaty, such as the Ghent altarpiece, which I think you'll hear another lecture about soon, and much more. But the sheer magnitude of Nazi looting and its genocidal aspects would eclipse all the previous efforts. The Nazis didn't just target the national collections of the conquered countries. As I mentioned earlier, they also bought huge amounts in the occupied lands. But the buying was far from normal because the money used was itself stolen from the treasuries of the conquered countries and from those from people persecuted by the Nazis. This is a Rembrandt from the Chabot collection that was sold in Holland during the war. The Nazis paid very well, and many willing sellers early on, early in the occupation of France and Holland, rushed to deal with them, offering items which ranged from junk to the top of the line in Austria, Czernin, Vermeer, the artist in his studio. But there was, of course, a very dark side to this trade. As the vies of the occupation tightened, especially for Jews, survival became the basis for many a sale. One could trade a painting or a service of some kind for a life. The famous scholar Max Friedlander is a case in point. He fled to Holland to escape persecution, and then when the Nazis took over there, he was sent to a concentration camp, but rescued by Goering, who wanted him to give expertise for some of the pictures in his collection. To keep him alive, there was an interesting competition. The SS, they kept wanting to put him in the camp, and Goering found him useful. So Goering made Friedlander an honorary Aryan. And so I've always thought that Friedlander must have really enjoyed telling Goering that this obviously faked Vermeer by Van Meegeren was the real thing. Now, this was Goering's favorite painting. His wife had it in their luggage when they were arrested. And people say, I haven't really checked this, that it was the only thing he regretted during his Nuremberg interrogations was the fact that he'd been fooled by this painting. The second way the Nazis got things in Western Europe was by simply confiscating the private collections of those who didn't fit into their idea of the pure Germanic Empire. The legal basis for many of these confiscations, which violated the rules of warfare, was that the owners had abandoned their property and fled, therefore forfeiting their citizenship and ownership rights. That meant if you'd left it in the bank and then you left, or you left it with a dealer or in storage, you had abandoned it. And this was particularly cynical as those sent to death camps were considered to have fled. Appeals were accepted if a person, by producing endless documentation, could prove he was an Aryan. He got a certificate like this one in France. It says Certificate of Non-Membership in the Jewish Race, and he could avoid deportation and keep his possessions. But few of those targeted were in this category, and the take was enormous, especially in France. Thousands of works were brought into the Jeu de Paume Museum, later used for Impressionist art and whatnot. The items looted were shown in special exhibitions. This is a picture from one of those exhibitions. set up so the Nazi leaders could choose what they wanted. Hitler himself never came to these shows. In fact, he only went to Paris once, which is kind of amazing when we think of the trouble he went to get Paris. He was sent fancy albums full of photographs of the loot and got first choice and took only the very best things. Goering came many times and did very well, managing to fill up 8 houses. This is Goering leaving the Jeu de Paume. Filled up 8 houses like this one. This is Karenhall, his main residence outside of Berlin, with his treasures. Here, too, degenerate works were separated from the rest and sold or bartered to dealers who fed them into the general art market. And this is a room in the Louvre where they put the degenerate art that had been confiscated, and it was sold off or used for exchanges. The Nazis would trade, for example, more than a dozen Picassos, Matisses, etc., for one bad old master painting. And there were a whole series of these exchanges. The looting eventually included not only valuable works of art, but the entire contents of victims' houses. This is one warehouse full of furniture and other personal possessions that the Nazis did not manage to remove from Paris before the liberation, but quantities like this had been going to Germany for months, and they were given to people, a lot sent to Eastern Europe where they were recolonizing Poland, and given to people whose houses had been bombed out in Germany. There was resistance to this confiscation process. In France, Rose Valland, who was one of my favorite characters, she was a minor curator at the Louvre, and she was really my inspiration. I was in Brussels before I started working on this, and I read her obituary in the Herald Tribune, and it said that she had personally saved 60,000 works of art, and I thought, wow, that's during the war. So that was what got me started looking into the whole question. But anyway, she was quite a heroine. Over and over again, she risked her life to smuggle out photographs and coded lists of the hiding places to which the works were being sent. And at the end of the war, working with resistance operatives in the French railroad system, she managed to delay a whole trainload of art until the Allies arrived. And this is the basis for a movie called The Train with Burt Lancaster, which I highly recommend. It has a beautiful, glamorous actress playing Rose Valland, but that's okay. And it's not quite accurate, but it's fun. But there's the real train. As the tide of war turned, the restraints shown by the Nazis in regard to the state-owned collections in the West faltered badly. Himmler tried to make off with the Bayeux tapestry, but was thwarted by the fall of Paris. His colleagues in Belgium did better, taking in a small boat on a stormy sea, really scary, Michelangelo's beautiful Bruges Madonna. Far more impressive was the removal of about half the treasures of Florence to a remote castle on the Austrian border, supposedly for protection, but the masterpieces were moved in open trucks. You can see the truck right there, right through the battle zones up toward Germany. When Allied forces crossed into Germany in late 1944, even after all they'd seen everywhere else, the monuments, they found the conditions in Germany really shocking. And they called these skeleton cities that had been bombed and burned out, and it really, there were no governments. There were homeless DPs wandering around, citizens and freed prisoners who wandered around burning priceless books and furniture to keep warm. And anybody could pick up whatever they wanted in the ruins and the unguarded refuges where the pictures and art had been hidden. There were few buildings left to protect here, and the monuments men didn't know whether the great German collections or the Nazi loot had survived or where they were hidden. There was a lot to look through. This is a typical church that all those boxes and packages had to be examined, to see what was in them. There were thousands of places like that. The German government, as the bombing had increased, had hastily moved everything it could to hundreds of salt mines, castles, caves, and even cowsheds. And most famous of these was the salt mine at Aussee, which was specially fitted up for Hitler's collections. But there were lots of others, like the Merkers mine, which held not only tons of art, but the entire gold reserves of the Third Reich. Every day, the monuments men discovered thousands of irreplaceable things in danger of destruction. And it was really very much like Indiana Jones. They were booby-trapped. There were things behind brick walls. Goering's collections were scattered. Goering's curator, this is Goering's curator, were scattered in around Berchtesgaden, where he'd taken them on his special trains. And this man said, oh, they're all arts here, but we got it completely legally, and it's really beautiful stuff. And Life magazine took this picture, and he was quite a hero for a while till, the real monuments man got there. He had taken his stuff to Berchtesgaden on several of his special trains, and they were first looted by the locals, and then the 82nd Airborne, in a job unusual for them, helped unload the rest. But there was more everywhere. The crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire, which had been taken from Vienna by Hitler, were found walled up in Nuremberg, and the confiscated French collections in the fabled castle of Neuschwanstein. And the quantities are just vast and unbelievable. These are the Rothschilds' jewels at Neuschwanstein, Torah scrolls by the thousands, and all protected as best could be by the army. But there was so much to protect that the army soon had to decide what to do with it all. And after Eisenhower looked at a few of the storage places, it was decided to bring it all together in several collecting points, which would soon have better collections than most museums in the world. There's a nice piece there. The U.S. Army was anxious to be rid of responsibility of all the art, and our policy was to send everything back to the country from which it had been removed and let people there worry about who it belonged to. So back, everything went in trains. There's the lady with the ermine going back to Poland, and planes, and often with joyful celebrations. This is the Florentine works arriving back in that city. Once the things were back, special commissions in each country had to figure out just who the objects belonged to. Not an easy job when it came to confiscated private collections. This is a Chardin from the Mannheimer collection, now at the Metropolitan Museum, and it has a long story, which I don't have time to tell today, but it took many years to figure out where it should go. State collections were less of a problem, but here politics tended to affect restitution. In one controversial decision in 1945, the United States briefly brought back to Washington 202 major works from the Berlin museums. This was partly because of the terrible state of the museums in Germany, but the decision was encouraged by the fact that the Soviets were stripping their zone of everything of value they could find and taking it back to Russia. The Soviet Union also had specialists in their army. They were called trophy brigades, and they, of course, had found tons of art, too. And they had quite different ideas about restitution and simply sent it all home, regardless of ownership. In the 1950s, thousands of items like this Dürer Madonna were returned to the state museums of the East Bloc countries. This was sent back to Dresden. But anything belonging in the West or that belonged to private individuals remained hidden in the Soviet Union until the 1990s in remote monasteries and other places, or in the secret vaults of the Hermitage and the Pushkin. I showed you one before. Here's another Van Gogh. And the curators of these museums, on pain of being sent to Siberia, were not allowed to reveal where the art was hidden. Included in these hoards were hundreds of major paintings and drawings and objects from German museums and items looted by the Nazis in the West, as well as things belonging to German collectors. And it's only since the dissolution of the USSR that the Russian museums have dared exhibit these works, and there's continuing political controversy there over who should keep them. The Russian Duma has nationalized these things, and so that there are continuing negotiations sort of sub rosa between governments, and a few things have been returned, some archives, a few drawings, but the big ticket items like the Schliemann Trojan gold treasure, the Pushkin has it in an installation that looks like Fort Knox, and you feel that that's never going to go anywhere. And you know, the bitterness in the former Soviet Union over the treatment of their people by the Nazis during the war is still extremely strong. I mean, 20 million Russians died, so you can understand where they're coming from on that. Of course, not everything was recovered by the official agencies of East and West. Hundreds of works are said to have been stolen, hidden, or destroyed, but you can never be sure. There's this Raphael from Poland, which is supposed to have gone to Germany, and then nobody knows where it went after that. A Bellini from Berlin that was supposedly burned up in a fire in the bombing at the end of the war. But so if this Raphael is in your attic, please call the State Department. The restitution of recovered private items following the war was not easy, nor was it always fair. If one's possessions were relatively major, like the Vermeer astronomer that belonged to the Rothschilds, and it had been chosen by the likes of Hitler and Goering, recovery was relatively straightforward. Their collections were carefully cataloged by the Nazis, and they listed the original provenance without any shame at all. Even then, making claims was hard work, requiring endless paperwork and dealings with the bureaucracies of several nations. And many claimants gave up altogether or made bad settlements that would haunt them later. For things that had utterly vanished, the German government did give some compensation, quite a bit of compensation in the 60s. It was and is far harder to recover things that were dispersed in the art market and could have gone most anywhere. One of the main issues in such restitutions has been determined whether or not a sale was forced, and many were not. In general, willing sellers forfeit their title and the works revert to the state, as was the case with the Vermeer Artisan Studio. But as I mentioned earlier, the determination of coercion is not always easy. At the end of the war, before all the evidence of Nazi crimes was in, restitution was refused in many cases. In the last year, some of these cases have been revisited, and a number of the decisions have been reversed. The revival of restitution has done tremendous good and righted many wrongs, and it will continue to do so as long as it remains honest. This good must not be undone by narrow agendas, excessive greed, or false morality. 75 years after the beginning of the Nazi era, it's time to work out sensible solutions. The legacy of Nazi looting lingers on. Many objects remain to be found, but the miracle is that so much survived the devastation of the most destructive war in history, like the windows of Chartres Cathedral. This was not by chance, and we owe an enormous debt to people of all kinds who risked their lives to safeguard the human patrimony. Several monuments men were killed in the line of duty, and I think of Rose Valland, who I talked about before, men like Cesare Fazola, who was the librarian of the Uffizi, who on foot crossed and recrossed the battle lines to persuade Germans and Allies not to use the room in which this painting was stored as a latrine, or use this one as a tea table. Michelangelo. So I hope that the next time you wander through the peaceful galleries of a museum anywhere in the world, you will think of the adventures that these silent objects have had. So thank you very much.